Mr. Steinley, please.
Well, to answer your question, we definitely do care. I come from a third-generation farm and a beef farm in southwest Saskatchewan, so we know exactly some of the struggles you're going through. In this very committee, we had the agriculture minister here, and I asked him point blank, who did you talk to about the capital gains increase before the budget? And I asked him twice, and he finally admitted he couldn't talk to anyone because he did not know that the capital gains increase was in the budget. My question is for the Docherty family. The Minister of Agriculture is from PEI. Has he talked to any producers about the capital gains increase since it was announced? And who do you think he's actually listening to?
I'll answer that. To my knowledge, no. He certainly never contacted us, but he certainly never contacted us on the seed issue. Now, he may have had a meeting in a phone booth maybe with a few locals. I don't know. He's also went on record as saying that people he's talked to think the carbon tax is a great thing. Now, I'd really like to meet them people. They're obviously not farming. So you can take that all with a grain of salt.
And Logan, you mentioned the capital gains is probably one of the biggest hurdles to young farmers. To your knowledge, has the minister or anyone consulted with young farmers in PEI about how the capital gains increase is going to affect the intergenerational transfer of a family farm?
As far as I know, there hasn't been a single meeting with any young farmers of PEI. There hasn't been any reaching out to our Malpec, our MP for Malpec, or not ours, but the MP. Unfortunately, it gets back to my question is, do they really care? And if they don't, because they're all going to have a cushy pension, then why would they worry about us?
This probably won't make you feel better, but you're not alone in not being listened to. I have a press release from the government of Saskatchewan, and on August 9th, at the federal, provincial, territorial meetings of agriculture ministers across the country, 7 ministers, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Manitoba, all the provincial ag ministers asked for this to be reversed because it does nothing to help the agriculture sector in our country. So you're not alone in this, agriculture minister, not listening to anyone in the sector. I'm going to shift to the grain growers. You have some documentation. If you have any other documentation, I'd love for you to table it for this committee when it comes to capital gains. But I just wanted to read one of the line items you have here is, before June 25th, the capital gains tax would have been $3,020,000. After June 25th, on an average farm in Saskatchewan, the capital gains payment went up to $3.9 million, an increase of $924,000. Do you think any farm can withstand that hit and actually make the next generation viable in farming in Saskatchewan or any other province?
No, absolutely not. As we know, and as the Dochertys certainly know, young farmers are already facing millions of dollars in debt to have to take over their family farms. And what I said in my opening remarks when I mentioned that the government has moved the goalpost for those young farmers, they've moved the goalpost by either $900,000, $1 million, $2 million, $3 million. It depends the size of your farm and your operation, obviously. But most farmers across the country are going to face a very much higher capital gains tax bill at the time of succession.
I'll move back to the Dochertys for a second because I just had it's a simple question. Over the last 9 years of this Liberal government, can you think of one agriculture policy that they've implemented that's helped the family farm?
I certainly can't. I guess my mind gets boggled with the fact that our federal government last year gave $15.5 billion away. Not to Canadians, but to other countries. But yet, we got farmers struggling. We're feeding the country. And there's absolutely no recognition for that. And I don't know of a thing they've done, but they've pretty well destroyed anything they touched. And I'm speaking especially on behalf of the seed potato growers in Prince Edward Island.
You said your costs have gone up by about 20% just because of the carbon tax. Can you share with the committee how much you've got back in rebates in the carbon tax?
Absolutely none. Zero. Like, I just don't get it. The problem with the carbon tax, it's hidden. We have no idea. Like, I'll give you an example. I bought a Baron for my potato digger this fall, $180. Well, how much of that, or how many times did carbon tax get put on that Baron from the cardboard that was packaged in the plastic? We have no idea. So we just know it's 20%, and over the next 5 years, like, what's their cost going to go up 100%? There's 2 million people going to the food banks now. Like, what do they want? 50% of the country starving to death?
Thanks for that. Mr. Larkin, you've done some numbers when it comes to the carbon tax as well. Can you tell us what it's going to cost the grain growers across the country when the carbon tax is fully implemented by 2030?
Yeah, great question. I don't have the numbers with me right now, but the research that we just did through the Agricultural Carbon Alliance found that the average grain farmer is paying right now around $18,000, and that's going to increase, obviously, exponentially going into 2030. And so throughout the life of the carbon pricing scheme, we see individual farmers paying upwards of $400,000, which could be rather spent on more innovative technologies, such as the most innovative grain dryers that exist today.
How much would they be getting back?
That's time. I'll let Mr. Larkin answer that later, perhaps.
Ms.
Now
Root for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for being here. Thank you to the Dohertys for being here. It's great to see a 7th-generation potato farm nonetheless. We have that in common, as I'm a 3rd-generation potato farmer. And I'm just curious if Mr. Doherty, either one of you, just wondering how you feel today, knowing that you've come all the way from PEI. You mentioned earlier that your own members of Parliament haven't consulted you, didn't consult you on any of these changes to the capital gains. I'm wondering how you feel here today when we have a member from PEI who's actually sitting in the committee subbing in for somebody today, and you didn't even get a question from a member of Parliament from PEI. How are you feeling right now?
I guess it really don't surprise me. I don't know whether they were on a gag order not to talk to potato growers. I assume that. But I'll go back to March of, or April of 2022. The same MP that's subbed in here this morning took offense, he said, to a question that the seed potato industry was in chaos in PEI, and he made that a very vocal point that it wasn't. Well, here we are, I think Monday makes 3 years, and we're still not allowed to sell seed, so I take offense to the fact that, or I'm offended, I guess, by the fact that he was offended by saying it was chaos. But it doesn't surprise me. I live 6 miles from my local MP. We invited them many times to come to our farm. Never showed. And there's Malpec riding, produces 80% of the seed potatoes in PEI. Not a peep. So the gag order, I guess, is working. That's all I can say.
Thank you. I can say I've been to PEI a couple of times in the last couple of years and visited with many potato farmers out there. And I know when our operation was going at size in Ontario, we were buying seed potato out of PEI. And I just want to commend you all on the work that you do. You did mention earlier that you saw a 1 in 700 year type flood. And I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit further, because as a 7th generation farms here, so are you 6th and 7th generation? I'm sure you've seen a lot of different weather patterns over the years, and how do you see it changing a lot in most recent years, or how have you been affected by the weather changes lately in the operation, or is this something that is cyclical in your opinion after all these years?
I guess what happened in our farm that day was very rare, and it hasn't happened again. I don't expect it to, or don't plan to. But the problem within our court systems, there was another farm, which again, 2 years before our situation, had it happened, and the judge said, you know, they could have done more to prevent the problem. Well, if we had built a 40-foot cement wall, if we had known in advance, 6 months ahead of time, what was going to happen. We built a 40-foot wall to keep the water from going in the streams, and it still went over the top. They would have said they should have built it higher. Like, there's no common sense is the problem.
Do you have any idea what the land values are in PEI? Because we heard earlier what they would be in Alberta and Ontario.
Yep. Anywhere from 6,000 an acre to, depending on where it's located and how big the field is, probably up to 10 or 12,000.
Right. And Mr. Ross, I might turn over to you here because we do see with intergenerational transfers, and my family is no different in trying to do succession planning. Are there obstacles is it specifically in each province to those intergenerational transfers? And I'd also ask, like, we hear a lot of people talking about farmers selling their land and having it paved over into subdivisions. And Mr. Doherty mentioned earlier about succession and how farmers have all of their money tied up in assets, and assets are not always paid off. Contrary to what we heard from the Liberal members earlier today, assets don't mean that you are rich. Assets mean that you probably still owe a lot of money, and as a farmer, I know that, and being a young farmer trying to get into the business is very difficult. We heard $6 million worth of just equipment needed earlier for these potato farmers, and that's a seed potato operation. That's not a fresh market operation like I've been involved in my lifetime, and that's far greater than that. So what do you see as the biggest impediment, I guess, for farmers who are trying to transfer their farms over intergenerationally?
About 30 seconds.
I would say, I mean, you rightly pointed out, I mean, we are at record levels of farm debt in Canada. We are at roughly $140 billion of farm debt being held across the country right now. And so the land prices vary dramatically from province to province, but I think the common burden is twofold. One being the access to capital and the cost of taxation associated with the transfer, and two is the fact that increasingly these large farms are sophisticated operations, and there needs to be a long-term planning process, and sudden changes like what was done this year with the capital gains destabilizes that fundamentally for those intergenerational farm transfers.
Thanks, Mr. Ross. Thank you, Ms. Rude. Thanks to our witnesses. If you don't mind, colleagues, I just had a couple of quick questions to ask, and maybe to Mr. Larkin, to my colleague, Mr. Rand's question. He was mentioning, there are different tax codes and stuff with each province, but I believe that the data that you submitted last spring, you did have a breakdown of the difference in each province, but the average was that 30%. Am I accurate in that assessment?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. We considered all the different tax schemes that are in different provinces. Everything kind of changes, but on average, we saw 30%. So some provinces were 29%, some were 32%. Take it across the country, and we saw a 30% tax increase.
And maybe to Mr. Ross or to Mr. Larkin, it just seems that we've had every spring, we had the underused housing tax, the Bear Trust tax change, now the capital gains inclusion rate change. What kind of, you were talking about the impact on accountants and farmers who are going to their accountants. What kind of frustration is this? It just seems to be this stop and go where they're putting these new taxes on producers every spring. Is this happening? Is it not happening? And they've had to back off on the Bear Trust at the very last minute. What kind of frustration is this putting on your members and your discussions with financial advisors and accountants?
I would say it's adding considerable frustration, but also just uncertainty. To Mr. Larkin's point earlier, we could not get definitive assessments of the impacts of these changes that were incorporated very quickly or implemented very quickly until months after the initial announcement took place, because we were waiting on draft legislation. And then, as you suggested, there's this back and forth of potential changes and tweaks that follow. So the net result is that advisors weren't even in a position to provide financial advice for some time after the announcements were made, and that creates immense frustration when you're especially in the midst of a very long, drawn-out succession plan that could be 9/10 of the way through, and suddenly this throws a complete curveball in what you've been working on for upwards of a decade.
If you want to add, Mr. Larkin.
I can tell a small story to that, which I think really highlights the issue. I know a farmer in Saskatchewan who used to own 8,000 acres, family farm. This was announced through Budget 2024. That individual had still 5 years in their succession planning, and their succession planning, they didn't have a son or daughter or nephew, niece that could take over. So their succession plan was always to sell it to another farm. But they still had 5-7 years to go in their farm. But because of this quick announcement that was then implemented on June 25th, they decided to quick step their succession plan and actually sold out their 8,000 acre family farm to a large 100,000 acre plus corporate farm. So it's a small example of how this is accelerating the loss of family farms across the country.
Just two last quick ones. I know that the government has talked about the Canadian Entrepreneur Incentive, and you did talk about changing the rules to allow farmers to qualify for that. But it's my understanding that if you are an incorporated farm, which the vast majority would be, even though it's in the family, they do not qualify for that program. Is that correct? And if maybe CFA or Mr. Larkin, if you guys could submit how many farms would actually, of that 190 farms, would actually qualify for that incentive, and how many would not? I think that would help us out with this analysis as well. And my last question to the Dohertys, and Logan, good to see you here as well. We need the voice of that younger farmer. In my conversations with my constituents all summer on this issue, the number one thing that came up with succession planning is the mental health toll that this has taken, as you've done years of that transition planning, and this has completely scrapped that. Now you have to start over. As a young farmer looking at getting into this industry, what is your frame of mind here, and your with this capital gains inclusion rate change? Your father talked about the carbon tax and other input costs. Do you still see farming as a viable option, or what is your outlook?
My personal outlook is, if I knew 9 years ago, whenever the Liberal government took government, that they were basically going to try and do everything they can to destroy my family farm.
I'll take over for that. It's hard to describe everything we've been through with, and we've been at this for probably 4 years now. And I talked to our accountant the other day, and he said maybe it's going to take another 5 years to finish, which is insane. Like, the way I look at it, and I've said it for quite a number of years, is if I give the farm to the boys, forget about money, I would hope they could keep going and not go broke. And I always said, just don't lose the place. But it's so sad, the state of the country now, and I don't believe farmers perhaps even understand, but under the advice of my accountant, I had to buy a $2 million life insurance policy for the fact if I get hit by a bus this afternoon when I walked out here, the government of Canada is going to destroy our farm just for taxes. It's insane.
Thank you very much, Mr. Doherty. Mr. Doherty, you can certainly sense your passion and the pressure you feel you're under. Thank you very much for sharing your story with us. And Mr. Larkin, Mademoiselle Bissonnette, and Mr. Ross, thank you very much for coming. We will suspend for a couple of quick minutes and welcome the next panel. Meeting suspended, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both witnesses for being here this morning. Mr. Nelson, your story is remarkably familiar, as I'm third generation, and I'll maybe come to that in a moment. So I'm going to ask you a bit. I know with the sudden change, I'm going to assume that you and your wife were doing some planning for a while. I was in the same situation watching my children grow and then realizing both my own life path and theirs were not going to lead to a next generation, in my case. Where to from here? Can you expand? I know it's been a very relatively short period of time, even though it's been several months. I know how long succession planning takes. Can you comment on perhaps a bit on what your options are? And ideally, if this change did not come into place, would you carry on with what you and your wife planned?
So at this point, we're in a holding pattern. Like I had said previously, we're looking to the next step, but that's completely been put on hold currently. We have downsized what we can, but also being cognizant of the fact that the business is still a machine that requires a certain amount of revenue just to run, just to stay open, and we're cutting back as much as we can. My wife has actually been doing a lot more off-farm work, which is curious that this seems to be coming up more and more. And that has alleviated a lot of pressure for us. And doing things like this, coming out to tell people my story and hoping that there's some solutions that come in our future that are going to work for us.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I'm going to depart from a bit of a normal process of quitting, and I'm certainly, Mr. Nelson, if you have anything else to add, and, in response to this, Mr. Mount, if you want to supply any other comments as well. I want to start with, it's coming out of some of the questions from the first panel. Personal experience, my wife and I got married in 1985 and purchased a farm. We were lucky. It was backstopped by my father and mother from the guarantee, but we purchased a large farm at the time, $360,000 of debt. Therefore, we had $360,000 of equity of assets. And I think when the Canadian public watches this, they all of a sudden think, you're rich. Well, no, I had $360,000 of assets offset by $360,000 worth of debt. And that's how I began as a third-generation farmer. And so when we hear about the numbers today, imagine $360,000 from 1985, what's that in today's dollars? 1.6 to 1.8 million. Wasn't automatically rich. I just had that many assets and that much debt to begin a business career. And so I think at times Canadians don't fully appreciate the business of agriculture, which is capital intensive, and how to begin that process. So I've been through succession now twice, once on the way in and once on the way out. I see from the Library of Parliament, which always does such a good job of providing background information, that only 12% of farmers have got succession plans in place, and any policy that this committee would recommend, I think, would be great in spurring more farmers to have that. So I can ask, actually, triggers a question, Mr. Nelson. Did you have anything written down as far as you developed together with your wife or your family as far as where you want to go?
So yes, with our financial advisor and accountant, we've been developing this plan for several years now. It's based on the life expectancy of an average Canadian, and to have a reasonable retirement from the age of 65 on.
So you were also a part of the 12% that actually were proactive and working ahead, recognizing the kind of business that you were in, only to have the government throw a curveball into years of planning.
Correct.
Right. If I can also put into the record, we went through a similar process. We actually, together with my brother and I, used the incorporation as a process to buy our parents' assets out over time. It took us about 6 years, but we then became an incorporated model from a private partnership prior to that, and then over time. And then we also tried to do everything right, worked with professionals, and developed our own, between my brother's family and myself, a succession plan. And we dealt with all of the 3Ds. And we forgot something, and I've actually had numerous conversations with other farm families, and that's why I actually feel somewhat obligated to put this on the record here. If you're in a business relationship, it is through insurance possible to deal with the death, divorce, disability processes. And also in the fact of disagreements, it's also possible to set up mechanisms inside a business plan that over time can develop transfers. One thing our family forgot, and perhaps you might be close to the situation, is that we forgot to deal with something called voluntary withdrawal of a partner. And in discussions with many farm families, where one partner now wants out, and quite frankly, I'm blessed with 4 daughters. They're going 4 different directions. None were down the ag side. I hear that in your testimony as well. And so we didn't have a formal mechanism short of the blunt instrument of shotgun clauses, which, for those of you who don't understand, it's where one partner offers to buy the other out, and then makes him or herself vulnerable for the reverse offer back. But to deal with and negotiate through a process of voluntary withdrawal that, first of all, provides an income to the departing partner, but secondly, doesn't strangle the operation, and I think you would be in a similar situation with your operation, doesn't strangle the operation in its cash flow going forward. And I see, Mr. Chair, my time is coming to an end, so I will perhaps pick this up in another round.
Thanks, Mr. Epp. And I do have to admit, when you said you were going to go off script, I was a little worried what you were going to do. But no, it's a good life experience for sure. And now to the Liberals and Mr. Epp, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll direct my question then to Mr. Nelson. I understand that you two are also, despite it not perhaps being family, but working with Algonquin College in attracting or looking at other opportunities that extend. A personal comment, my nephew will be coming to the farm, forming the 4th generation. And so thanks to colleagues like ours with Bill C-208, that also provides those opportunities. But can you talk a little bit about your efforts there?
So one of my personal beliefs is I think volunteerism is very important. Tried to instill that in my own kids. And so a friend of mine and I, we were having a beer one night and we were chatting about the lack of education for farm kids and specifically the business part of it. A lot of farm kids, they know how to run the tractors and grow the wheat and, you know, bale hay. But what they don't know is all the laws behind labor, you know, all the business components. So we developed a course, and we went down this rabbit hole for 3 years, and then pitched it to Algonquin College. And after another 3 years, it became an actual program that is existing at the Perth campus now. So I think that yes, there needs to be a lot of work to allow farmers to succession plan and get out. I also think we need to better educate some of the young people to come in.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll conclude my comment and statement. It grows out of the first panel, and it grows a bit from Joyce Murray's comments and questions here. Agriculture is certainly not the only family-oriented, capital-intensive business that we have in Canada. But what does make it unique is that it's a high capital, high cost, low margin business that largely are price takers and largely deal with so many factors outside of their control, like weather. And in response to a recent survey, farmers actually can deal with the weather risk, the market risk. Their number one fear identified was actually government policy risk. And voila, here we sit today. So I'll conclude with that.
Thanks, Mr. Epp. And I think the other thing that makes it unique is it's perishable. When you make a widget, it doesn't necessarily go rotten, so or pass away.